Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Hello, and welcome to part 2 of an interview with science fiction writer and UFO investigator Mark O'Connell. If you haven't heard part 1 of this interview yet, you can check that out in episode 22, the one just before this one. And I strongly encourage you to do so because I think you'll like it. It's a really cool story about how Mark became one of the writers for Star Trek. He's got, there's a few episodes that came straight from his mind, and I just found it incredibly inspiring to hear someone talk about how that happened. You know, how does something begin in your imagination, and then you get it out on the page, you write it down, you send it in, and it gets to the writers, the main writers, the people who invented the characters, you know, these characters we care so much about. They read it, and they think, hey, you know what, that's pretty cool. This guy understands our characters, and this would make for a very entertaining episode. They take it, they make it into a script, the actors read it and act it out, and next thing you know, millions of people are watching an idea that started in someone's mind. In this case, Mark O'Connell's mind. But, you know, it could be your mind too. Anything's possible, and just to hear one guy's story about how this happened and the work he did to make that happen is just awesome and motivating, and it makes me want to go and write. So I will not delay this any further. You can find the show notes for today's episode, links to things we talked about, as well as the featured song that we wrote just inspired by this episode at othersidepodcast.com/23. And please, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them right there on that page or email us at show@othersidepodcast.com. So without further ado, here's the second half of the interview with Mark O'Connell. Take it away, Mike.
Star Trek's awesome, but it exists in the land of fiction. And you've gone on to become a UFO investigator. And that's something, you've taken your interest and brought it up to the next level. And I'd just be interested in, how did you get involved with, because you work with MUFON, right?
Not right away. That's not how it started, but that happened pretty quickly. What happened was, this was probably 2011, so 4 years ago or so. I was my agent at the time she was always after me to write a big new science. She was like, I know you love science fiction, so write me a big science fiction script. So I would always sort of go back to, okay, what my file of old ideas. Okay, is there anything in there that I can still work with?
Sure.
And a lot of my story ideas always centered around UFOs, aliens visiting the Earth. So I sort of got the bug again in 2011. Like, okay, maybe it's time for me to go there and try to write something really, really good about UFOs. But what can I do that would be really unique at this point? And I was just sort of puttering around online one day and thought, well, maybe I should. I had a good friend who writes a very successful photography blog.
Okay.
And at the time, he was always bugging me to start writing a blog, and I always said, "Well, there's nothing I'm that interested in that I could sustain writing about for months and months at a time."
Right, it's like having a magazine that you have to just keep going on.
It's hard work. It's really hard work. But then I thought, oh, well, wait a minute, UFOs. Maybe I should start writing a blog about UFOs, because I could see from poking around online that a lot of people were writing blogs about UFOs. So I thought, well, what the hell? Maybe that's what I should do.
And not a lot of them are very interesting, and a lot of them are crazy. Like the first, you read it and you're like, well, when the alien overlord said this to me, and you're like, give me that you lost me, obviously.
That does come up. Does come up. So, so I started putting some thought into it, and I thought, okay, there are already an awful lot of UFO commentators out there. And a lot of them have been doing this a long time and really know their stuff. And a lot of them are rank amateurs like me.
Okay.
But one thing they all seem to have in common is they all take themselves deadly seriously because they're terrified that people will, read their stuff, learn of their interest, and make fun of them for, how can you believe in that stupid stuff?
Right. Weirdos.
So there's this tendency among people who write about UFOs to just be incredibly, incredibly deadly serious, absolutely humorless, and even to the degree of downplaying the sensational aspects of the phenomenon, which I thought that's kind of crazy because that's what draws people to the phenomenon. That the spectacular weirdness of it is what interests people. So why would you shy away from that? And why would you try to take like all the life out of this really fascinating phenomenon? So that was where my mind was. And I thought, I'm going to start writing a UFO blog that's it kind of pokes fun of things if I see something that
Sure.
needs to be poked fun of. I'm not going to be serious. I'm not going to take myself seriously. I'll take the phenomenon seriously because if I didn't do that, there'd be no point in writing about it.
Right.
If I was just writing a blog where I was mocking stuff, I'd lose interest after about a week. So the ground rules for me were, I believe there is something going on with UFOs. I absolutely do. I think they are real. I think they are a real phenomenon. I don't know what they are or where they come from.
Right.
But I don't think that all these people who see them are hallucinating or are crazy. I think there is something real happening there. So that's the basis of the blog. But I also think that the way people pursue researching that phenomenon is sometimes very, very weird and creepy and funny. And when it is, I'm going to call it out in my blog. So that was sort of where I started from. So I started again. I'm poking around online a lot, just sort of looking for inspiration, looking for ways to get started. And I come across the MUFON website, and I had heard of MUFON for years and years because I've been reading UFO books.
Of course, I've got the Wisconsin sightings bookmarked. I suppose I should have Minnesota ones now too, but I bookmark it and I check it once a week to see like anything up in my neck of the woods.
Well, I was poking around this website, and in a corner of the website was a button that said, "Become a certified UFO field investigator." And I just thought, holy cow, I have to do that. That is what I will write about.
Right, certified, like for framing, like I'm in.
Yeah. And I thought, this is solid gold. I can do this for a few years, write a script based on my experiences. And in the meantime, because I don't want to have to wait a few years to write about it, I can blog about it as it happens. So
great idea.
That's kind of how the whole thing came about in the summer of 2011. And I just immediately started having a load of fun with it. My kids and my wife were a little. My oldest son, the first couple of months, my oldest son would just sort of go up to my wife and say, "We need to talk about my dad," because he was seriously concerned about my sanity. So finally, I just told him, I kind of told him what I've just told you. And he was like, "Okay, I get that. I can see where this is really fun for you. So I'll stop worrying about you."
Okay. Did the bug skip a generation?
Yeah, apparently it has. Okay. I'm sad to say.
It happens.
I'm not sure what I'm going to do about that, but yeah.
I think kids always do like whatever the opposite their parents are, and then you find out the grandkids probably are going to be aliens. So then you're right. Comes right back to the circle.
Well, so that's how the whole thing first started, and then so then I started the process of becoming a MUFON field investigator. Well, to do that, you have to pay, I don't know, it's $60 or $70 for their field investigator guidebook, and you have to read through this guidebook and learn it all and memorize it all. And then when at the end of that, then you take a test, and if you pass the test, then you become a certified field investigator, and they'll start sending you out to investigate cases, which you now know how to do because you've memorized everything in the field book.
Right.
So, and I deliberately stretched out that whole process because I was having so much fun blogging about the experience of learning all this stuff and working my way up towards the exam. I didn't want to rush through it. I wanted to milk it out for as much material as I could.
Absolutely.
So I was probably the slowest student they've ever had in MUFON.
That might be saying something, but
It might.
What anything in the handbook that you were like, what's this? Anything in the handbook that kind of weirded you out, or?
Well, yeah, because again, MUFON takes itself very, very seriously.
Absolutely.
And they're not afraid to go to. There's a whole lot of stuff in the field book that had to deal with what to do when you're investigating a UFO crash site. And this is not tongue in cheek. It is deadly serious.
All right.
So, and they have, earlier on, they give you instructions for what you have to put together in your go pack. You need to have this tote bag or backpack, sitting next to your front door, ready to grab whenever you go out the door to investigate a UFO sighting.
Of course, the UFO crash, you need your go pack. I've got one myself.
Well, there you go. So you're ready. If we have a crash, I'll call you up and we'll go investigate it together.
Hell yeah.
But they're deadly serious about it because they fully expect that at some point or another a UFO is going to crash, and it might be in your neighborhood, and you will be the first person on the scene. And what will you do? How will you, will you tell law enforcement about it or not? Will you have a handy little Geiger counter with you? And if the Geiger counter is going off the scale, what's the safest way to approach the downed UFO if you care to approach it at all? And the field investigator's guide is filled with stuff like this. It's got like an alien identification guide. There are 5 or 6 pages that are just covered with drawings of different types of alien, so that when you'll know it when you see one out in the field.
Sure, like like when they describe people in the police lineup or something like that.
Yeah,
like that kind
exactly.
of book.
That's exactly what it's like. So that surprised me. That I was unprepared for because I thought it was a little absurd. I still haven't had a crashed UFO case.
That'd be awesome.
But it could happen anytime. Crash saucers, that's a whole other topic, but that's for a whole other conversation probably.
Okay.
But yeah, so that was kind of the big surprise there, was how seriously they took everything. But then I started getting cases, and almost right off the bat, in summer of 2012, had a case in the suburbs of Milwaukee that was really pretty interesting. And I can't say I did the best job investigating it. It was only like my 4th investigation.
Okay, so
I was
investigator.
So I was a little sloppy. I was a little sloppy with the investigation. I will admit that, due to lack of experience. But it was an interesting case, and it ended up being chosen by MUFON as one of the top 10 UFO sightings of 2012. So,
awesome.
Not that I can claim any credit for it, but it was kind of a kick to be put on the list and to be associated with it. But it was a mother and daughter in It was either Hartford or Heartland. I can never remember the difference between the two.
Hartford. Heartland is more south. Like Heartland's closer to McQuanago and stuff like that, and I think Hartford is not.
Okay, it was Hartford. It was the northerly. It was the more northerly Hartford.
Okay.
Hartford, yeah. Thank you. And it was an interesting case. The daughter had been visiting her parents at their house with her 4-year-old son. End of the evening, the daughter and her son were so it's a mom and dad, their daughter, and their grandson. That's the cast of characters. And so the daughter and the grandson are out in the driveway in their minivan getting ready to leave. The mom is standing right outside the driver's door of the minivan talking with her daughter before the daughter leaves. And the daughter looks past her mom over the roof of the mom and dad's garage and says, "Holy cow, do you see that thing?" And the mom turned around, and from her angle, she couldn't see it. And the daughter just said, "There's something above your house." So the daughter hops out of the minivan. She and her mom run around to the back of the house, around the garage to the back of the house, and they see this gigantic, brilliantly lit object moving through the sky above and behind their house. And it's moving it's mostly north to south for maybe 20 seconds. It passes behind some really tall evergreens at their lot line. So that's always a big thing when somebody sees a UFO either pass behind something or in front of something.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Because, that gives you a little spatial reference. So they saw this thing pass behind these tall trees, and then boom, it just shot away to the south and just disappeared, in a vanishing point. And they were pretty freaked out about it. So they reported this guy. Meanwhile, they're sitting there in the backyard, sort of gasping for breath, wondering what the heck just happened. And the daughter realizes, oh my God, my little boy is alone in the minivan.
Oh God.
They go running around to the front of the house. The little boy is just going berserk. He's bawling his head off because he could tell how scared his mom was when she got out of the minivan. And he thought something really scary and bad was happening. And he's just sitting there alone in the minivan bawling. A detail like that, to me, really adds some credibility to the story.
Sure.
Because why even include the kid in the story at all? It's an extraneous detail. But the fact that they ran back to the minivan and he was in tears, to me, was kind of a big deal in that story. So I go to investigate. In fact, my wife came with me because we were coming home from a wedding reception that night.
Okay.
So we stop at these folks' house, and we're kind of dressed up in our wedding reception clothes, and they were just nice as can be. The mom and the dad and the daughter were there. I guess she must have had a babysitter for her 4-year-old son. And so this was the big mistake I made in this investigation, was I did not separate the mom and the daughter and interview them separately.
Oh, sure. Sure.
They were both. We all just sat down on the deck of their house, and before I knew it, we're having this conversation, and they're both going over the events, and so that was my big mistake, was that I didn't separate them, and I asked the mom to draw what she saw, and she drew this thing that looked. It was sort of shaped like a lampshade, and it had a row of really bright lights around the lower rim of it. And so she draws this picture, and the daughter sort of is looking over her shoulder, and the daughter just sort of shakes her head in disgust. She just says, no, that's not what it looked like. So the daughter grabs a piece of paper and a pencil and draws the exact same thing. And I'm just looking at these two drawings. I mean, obviously their styles were different, but they drew the same thing. So I was sitting there wondering, why is the daughter saying that the mom's drawing is completely wrong? But here's another detail. So I thought that was an interesting detail.
Yeah, no, that's a great. She draws the exact same thing, and just to be, mean to her mom or whatever daughters are gonna do, she's like, no, let me tell you how it really was, and it's the same thing. Okay.
And again, I thought that was kind of an interesting, authentic moment for the two of them that made me kind of believe what they were telling me. And the third thing was, and they both told me this. At different points in the conversation, was that after this thing zipped away into the southern sky, and they're both standing out in their backyard wondering what the heck just happened and what they just saw, they both admitted to each other after a few minutes that the only thing they kept thinking when they were in the backyard watching this thing fly across their backyard, the only thing that either one of them was thinking was, oh my God, they're going to take me away and my family will never know what happened to me. So the mom was thinking, oh my God, they're going to take me away and my husband will never know what happened to me. And the daughter is thinking, they're going to take me away and my 4-year-old son is never going to know what happened to me. They both had that exact same thought. And you can tell when someone's being sincere, I think. And to me, they were both being very sincere and authentic. And I had no reason to doubt what they were telling me. I thought it was a pretty credible story. Still, after 4 years of doing this, it's probably one of the most credible accounts I've ever come across. And so, like I said, they turned it into one of the top 10. MUFON wanted to do some more PR stuff with it. Unfortunately, the mom at that point they had her mother. So a fourth generation now of the family, her mother was having some health difficulty, or no, I think had recently died since I had first talked to them. So they just,
they didn't want any more part of it, or they
didn't want a reporter from the Journal Sentinel calling them up and saying, tell us about your story. So that was that.
Well, and that, I think that adds credibility too, though, the fact that they weren't looking for more attention. That
exactly
more attention was offered and they turned it down.
Yeah, and I've come across that a lot, Mike. In a lot of these cases, it's very interesting because when I first came into this, my assumption was that a lot of these people would be attention seekers, and they're really not. It's surprising how few of them are attention seekers. A lot of these people, they reported what they saw simply because they wanted to find out if anybody else saw the same thing. That's it. And they don't need to go any further with it. Or in some cases, it's as simple as, I've been keeping this a secret for 20 years, and I just want to tell the story to somebody. I don't care what happens next. I don't care what you do with my story. As long as I've had a chance to tell you my story, I'm happy and I'm done. And then I never hear from them again because that's all they needed from the experience. It's
Right.
kind of interesting.
No, that is interesting that they feel like they have something to get off their chest to somebody who will take it seriously, document it, maybe look into it and everything. And right, that would be the first thing I would assume, that these people are attention seekers, because it's like the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah, and some of them are attention seekers. Trust me.
I bet.
I've investigated some really wigged out cases with some really unusual people. But another thing I hear a lot from people is when I first make contact with them, either through email or over the phone.
Yeah.
I hear this quite a bit. People will say, "Oh my God! When I reported this on the MUFON website, I never expected anyone would actually get in touch with me." And they're kind of a lot of these people are really just stunned that somebody is contacting them and wants to know more about what happened to them.
Then it's not just, right. They're not just sending it out into the big, like when you email Google for tech support.
Right. Excellent example.
Right. You never expect something back. And that's probably the same kind of thing. And, we've had a big, like, UFO, declassified information announcement in this last week.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about it, as far as to maybe explain it a little bit for listeners or anybody who may have read a couple of things on IO9 or a blog or something like that. I was just looking to unpack a little bit of what came out this week and why is it a big deal?
Okay. I'm not going to be able to give you a complete answer.
Of course not.
Because I still need to look into it somewhat myself. But the big news was that an amateur UFO researcher, through an incredibly long series of making Freedom of Information document requests from the U.S. government, they got a hold of something like 130,000 pages of documents from the U.S. Air Force's official study of UFOs, which was called Project Blue Book. Now, this also included, the Air Force actually had 3 different studies. Starting in 1947, the first study was called Project Sign. Project Sign was disbanded and then regrouped as something called Project Grudge. Project Grudge was disbanded, and a short time later, Project Blue Book was formed.
And that's the famous one we've all heard of.
Right. Project Blue Book is the one that's most well known. And so this researcher, as I said, has scanned 130,000 documents and made them available online for free to anybody who wants to look at them. And it is pretty amazing. The reason I'm not going to say it's as huge a thing as everybody says it is because I have already been using an online archive of the Project Blue Book files for the last 3 or 4 years that's been out there for anybody to use it all this time. So I'm not sure why this new person is getting all this credit, because I've already had access to the exact same thing. And in fact, I was doing a little looking into it today, and I just checked one document, the newly released archive, one document from that archive to compare it to the identical document from the older archive that I've been looking at for years. And the documents are exactly the same, but in the document from the new archive, the names have been redacted. And in the document from the old archive that I've been using for a long time now, the names are all there. So my initial impression of this new Blue Book archive is that it may not be as good as the one I've already been using. But the question remains, how come nobody knows about this one that's already been out there? Right. I don't quite get it. It's a real mystery to me. I haven't gotten my head around this yet.
Well, it could always be something like if it was released right before the internet, I feel like a lot of archives and a lot of information, that in the mid 90s or even in the late 90s before the Wayback Machine and before anything that's kind of released in that era almost gets lost sometimes.
Yeah. Well, my guess is, and again, I'll need to do more research on this to really know for sure, but my guess is, as far as this newly released archive, my guess is that it's probably a much bigger collection of documents than the archive I've been looking at so far. And I can also tell you, just from the little bit of time today I was poking around on it, it is very, very well organized and very easy to search. So I'm not dissing it at all. I think anytime we can get more information out there for public access, it's a great thing. So hats off to this guy for doing all this work and just sharing it with everyone.
So I mean, how many freedom to get that many documents? I mean, you just said to me 130,000.
I believe that's the number. Yeah.
I mean, whether it's 130,000 or whether it's 50,000, it's still multiples of tens of thousands.
Yeah.
So how many freedom of information requests do you have to do?
I can't even imagine, Mike. I don't know what the process is for a FOIA request. I don't know.
And that just seems like a guy's life work, obviously. I mean,
I tell you what, I have met several individuals in the field of UFO research who have that kind of persistence and dedication, and it's truly an amazing thing. It truly is. I've met a person, one of the sort of the keepers of the case files of J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies.
Okay.
Really, really fascinating woman, and she has sort of given over half of her basement for the storage of these precious files. She has spent years writing a paper about one particular UFO sighting that took place 40 or 50 years ago. She has basically dedicated the last, I don't know how many years of her life to just researching and writing about this one case. Every time she talks to me about this article, I'm just in awe. I could never do it. I can't believe that somebody has that dedication, but there are a lot of people out there doing UFO work who have that kind of dedication and loyalty, and it's an amazing thing. It's really impressive.
Yeah, that has to be. Well, I think about, I'm sure you've met Don Schmidt.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I interviewed him back for the Badger Herald in college, in 1997
Oh, wow.
or whatever. When he was coming to do a thing at the UW, I was like, oh man, we got to put this in the paper or find a way. And I remember everybody's making fun of me, like, you talked to the alien guy last night, and I'm like, it's the college newspaper, man. Like, this is the place where alien stories belong.
Yeah.
So I'm like, what are you making fun of me for? What are you? Woodward and Bernstein over here? I mean, you're talking about keg parties, but I think about him and Roswell, and how much of his life has been devoted to this one incident that took place in 1947. And that blows my mind sometimes, because it's almost like somebody with PTSD or something, that relives the incident over and over again. Like, there's something to prove there. There's something to get at. And, they'll do it till they're dead. And so I always thought Don was interesting, in particular because of just his, his tenacity for that one particular case. All right. A couple more things. And I know we've been talking forever, and I got to let you go. And number one, I want to mention, you mentioned J. Allen Hynek, and we talked about Project Blue Book. So we should tell people a little bit about the book you're working on. And when you get a release date and stuff, obviously we'll talk about it more. But who is J. Allen Hynek, and why are you spending years of your life dedicated to him?
Well, thank you for asking. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was an astronomer who taught the first half of his career, he taught astronomy at The Ohio State University. The second half of his career, he taught astronomy at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Mm-hmm. While he was working in Ohio in the late 1940s, flying saucers became a thing. The first modern flying saucer sighting took place in the summer of 1947. A private pilot in Washington, flying through the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, saw a string of silvery discs flying through the air, dodging in and out of the mountain peaks at what he estimated at about 1,200 miles an hour. It became a huge sensation. All of a sudden, people started sighting flying saucers everywhere around the U.S. That whole summer of 1947, the UFOs people just had UFOs on the brain. The Air Force was caught short. The Air Force's mission is to keep the skies over the United States safe. And all of a sudden, not long after the end of World War II, suddenly the skies above the United States are filled with all sorts of things that the Air Force can't identify, can't keep up with, can't shoot down, can't explain. It was really a major, major headache and embarrassment for the U.S. Air Force.
Absolutely.
But a visionary general, General Nathan Twining, decided that something needed to be done about it. And I found out a couple of years ago, Mike, you'll appreciate this. We talked about Monroe earlier. There's a city park in Monroe called Twining Park. Turns out it's named after Nathan Twining because he grew up there.
Oh, really? That's super interesting. That's funny. From Monroe, another UFO lover from Wisconsin. Right.
So Nathan Twining says we need to study this. We need to find out what's going on. And people listened to him. He had a high enough rank that people listened to him. And Project Sign was formed. Well, right off the bat, Project Sign was just overwhelmed with reports, and the reports just got weirder and weirder, and they couldn't explain them. But they realized that they had to explain them, and at all costs, they had to explain the UFO sightings as natural phenomenon or man-made phenomenon, just to ease the minds of the American public. So they decided they needed to draft a professional astronomer to go through all these reports they were getting and identify as many of them as possible as simple astronomical occurrences that were being misidentified as UFOs, as flying saucers. So the closest guy at hand was J. Allen Hynek, because the Project Sign was housed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Okay. Hynek was teaching at OSU in Columbus. Hynek already had lots of high security clearances. He had been doing a lot of classified government contracting work for really since the outset of World War II. So he was kind of a natural. He could be trusted. He knew how the government operated. He wouldn't question his bosses.
Right.
He would do what was asked of him, and he would be dependable. So the Air Force came to him at Ohio State and said, "Could you please, can we hire you for Project Sign?" Well, one thing led to another. Hynek took the job. He took great pleasure in the first few years. He took great pleasure in knocking down all these UFO sightings and saying, "Oh no, that was Venus. Oh no, that was a comet. Oh no, that was a bolide. That was a fireball.
That was a cloud of gas. Get out of here."
He was very good at it. He was very successful at it, and he enjoyed the hell out of it. But what happened then, after a couple of years, his contract was up. He went back to teaching. 2 or 3 years later, UFOs appear again. The Air Force comes back to Hynek at Ohio State and says, "Hey, we need you to look at these new cases again." And Hynek's reaction was, "What? UFOs are back?" He honestly thought that it was a post-war paranoia thing that had to do with Pearl Harbor. He thought that, give it time, it'll go away. So he's so shocked to find out that it hasn't gone away by 1952 that he starts to get curious about it as a scientist and think, maybe there's something interesting going on here. So as time goes on, he ended up, so as I said, Project Sign begat Project Grudge, which begat Project Blue Book. Hynek was, during this whole time, from 1947 to about 1969, Hynek was the only astronomical scientific advisor working on these projects. And so he saw every UFO case that was reported to the Air Force that went through Project Blue Book, Hynek had his hands on. So he knew everything. He knew every UFO case. He knew every kind of thing that was being seen in the sky. He knew it all inside and out. And what he kept coming back to was that no matter how hard he and the Air Force tried to explain all of them away, there was always this residue of 20% of sightings that could not be explained. And for the first couple of years, Hynek thought, hey, my batting average is 80%. I'm doing great.
Right.
Well, by the time the Air Force comes back to him, he's starting to think, hey, my average is only 80%. What's wrong? Why can't I explain these other 20? Something weird's going on here. So over time, he kind of converted, and he said, you know what? There is something unusual and real, apparently, going on here, and the Air Force really should spend some time studying this instead of just trying to dismiss it all.
Absolutely.
And so he became a huge thorn in the side of the Air Force, although they kept him under their employ until 1969.
Well, the devil you know.
Exactly. And for that very same reason, this whole culture of UFO enthusiasts that developed during the 40s and 50s and 60s came to see Hynek as kind of a traitor. You have access to all this information. You have the ear of the government. Why aren't you forcing them to admit that UFOs are real, that they're coming from other planets, and that there are aliens in them? And so he was hated on both sides, which made him a really interesting figure because he kind of had sympathies both ways. And because he was a scientist, he would only commit to a theory that could be proven. And there was nothing that could ever be proven with UFOs. So he never felt he could truly commit to, yes, I believe they're extraterrestrial. Yes, I believe they're experimental Soviet aircraft, whatever. He just refused to commit, which infuriated everybody on both sides.
Right. They need some kind of closure. And the guy in charge was a man of science, and he wouldn't give it to him.
Yeah, exactly. And it really rankled a lot of people, and it still rankles a lot of people. It still does. Any new UFO book that's been published over the last 10 years, look to the index in the back of the references and look at how many times Hynek is referenced in that book. In some books, he is referenced like 50, 100, more than 100 times.
Sure.
And he's usually, and when he is mentioned, it's usually very dismissively. Well, through the course of my UFO blog, I came into contact with folks in Chicago who still operate. Now, Hynek died in 1986. He's been gone almost 30 years. His UFO Research Foundation still exists in Chicago. It's still being run by some of his associates. And I met up with them in the course of writing my blog. They've always hoped that they could find a writer who would write the definitive account of Dr. Hynek's career, not just as a UFO hunter, but as an astronomer.
Right.
I put my hand up and said, I would love to do that project. And one thing led to another, and boom, I had access to all of the foundation's files, and they're all right in Chicago, so they're really easy to get to. He taught at Northwestern, so he has a huge archival collection at Northwestern. So I'm writing a book about his career, and I have all this career material of his, basically right in my lap. So it's been a very fun and interesting project. And,
well, that's fascinating. I mean, so you're writing the official biography of J. Allen Hynek.
Well, I don't like to call it a biography because it doesn't go a whole lot into his growing up and his family life.
Sure, like if he was beaten as a kid or something like that, you probably don't talk about that.
Exactly. So it's not that kind of story. It really does focus on his career. Obviously his family is part of the story. I was fortunate enough to interview one of his sons in September. That was a huge deal because the scientific director of Hynek's Scientific Foundation kept telling me, Hynek's kids do not like to talk about their dad's work. They will never want to talk to you. And I ended up interviewing one of his sons, and man, was he glad to talk about his dad's work. So it turned out that was a wrong assumption. So hopefully over time I will be able to interview at least one or two more of his kids. So, so the book is not a true biography. It's an account of his career.
Okay, well that's going to be really exciting, and I'm excited to read it and hear about it, especially because J. Allen Hynek's always been a figure that I've admired. For a while, you read about him, you're like, I think this guy's just he's just a talking head for the Air Force.
Yeah.
But when you do get into him, you realize that, he was someone who was trying to balance between, the ufologists and their theories, and the Air Force and their being dismissive and their rejection. And then you got to find a way in the middle, the scientist's way, which would be to look, I can't prove anything, but something's going on. If we can't, 20% of 1,000 sightings is still 200 unexplained things in the sky. And I don't know what's scarier, the fact that the government might not be hiding it, the fact that they don't even know what's going on. So I'm really excited for that book.
Well, thanks. So the book is titled 20%. In honor of those unsolvable cases that really always rankled Dr. Hynek and sort of served as the spur for his career in a lot of ways. What I'm hoping for is, Mike, I've been working on it for a long time. I'm currently trying to secure representation from a literary agent. That's been a very time-consuming process, but
sure.
But we've had some positive developments over the last month, so that's great. What I'm ideally hoping for is that this book would be published in March 2016, because that will be the anniversary of the infamous Michigan swamp gas case, which actually put Hynek on the map as a UFO god, but it was also, in his words, the worst experience of his career. So,
you'll have to, real quick, sum up the Michigan swamp gas case. One last thing for our listeners. Just because if you're going to tease us like that, you got to give us a little detail.
All right, I'll just give you the quick 5-cent version. March 1966, southeastern Michigan, in and around Ann Arbor, Michigan. For a period of about 2 weeks, there were multiple UFO sightings. It started out with police officers out on patrol at night, seeing strange lights in the sky and giving chase to them, and getting all excited and seeing different shapes and sizes of these lights and never being able to keep up with them. And this is and they were policemen, so they had to report this in their logbook. So there's this there's documentation of these sightings. Well, after a couple of weeks of this, a farmer and his family that lived outside of Ann Arbor, out in the boonies, saw some strange lights settled into some swampland behind their farm, and the dad and his son stalked this thing. Sheriff's deputies were called in. There was a long period that night where people were stalking these lights through the swamp, but never caught up with them, and then they disappeared.
Okay.
The very next night in Hillsdale, Michigan, about 90 miles away, at a small community college, 87 women living in the women's dormitory at this college saw strange lights apparently come down from the sky and land in the University Arboretum, which was just outside. It was about 1,500 feet from their dormitory. So over the course of like 4 hours, 87 young women are watching this thing, whatever it is, in the college Arboretum. And the accounts of that they're just priceless. The way that these kids observed and processed and recorded what they were experiencing that's been one of the funnest parts of this book to write. It's total entertainment. But they brought in their dorm house mother and the local civil defense agent, and so the combined run of these sightings over the period of about 2 weeks made huge national headlines.
Sure.
Project Blue Book did not want to touch it at first, but bowing to public pressure, they finally sent Hynek over from Evanston. They sent him over to Ann Arbor. Hynek spent 3 days in the vicinity. The whole thing had become such a huge circus. It had become a media circus. It had become a political circus. And Hynek gets on the scene and finds himself just in an impossible situation. There are so many witnesses, and there are so few accounts that actually jibe, that he has to make some executive decisions about which cases he's going to look at and which testimony he's going to look at. Sure. And he decides to ignore some of the sightings and ignore some of the witnesses. And what he ends up, and you can understand why he did that. He had to contain what he was investigating. Otherwise, he never could have investigated any of it at all.
Right. There's dozens of witnesses.
Yeah. So he had good reason to do this. Meanwhile, the Air Force is putting intense pressure on him to hold a press conference immediately and defuse this situation and explain these things away as a natural phenomenon once and for all. So one thing leads to another. The Air Force forces Hynek to hold a press conference after 3 days. Hynek still does not have an explanation for what's been going on, but he has to get in front of what was described as the biggest press conference ever held at the Detroit Press Club in March of 1996. And Hynek says, I could not make the case for this in a court of law, but it's possible that what these people saw was swamp gas. And he goes on to add all sorts of qualifiers and explanations as to how he came to this conclusion. But at that point, nobody was even listening to him. All people heard was swamp gas.
Right.
And he said immediately the reporters were running to the phones to call in their stories. And the next day, the newspapers were just full of, the Air Force's number one UFO expert says that the people of Michigan are idiots. That was the storyline that took hold. And the entire population of Michigan was furious.
Of course.
As I said, Hynek described it as the low point of his career because it wasn't at all how he would have liked to have conducted an investigation in the first place, but it definitely was nothing at all like how he would have wanted to handle the information, how the information was presented and dispensed to the public. Everything was done wrong. Everything was done as wrong as it possibly could have been done. And Hynek looked like a fool, and people hated him, and people still hate him for the swamp gas incident.
Right.
It's like the biggest sin ever committed in UFO research was the swamp gas hypothesis.
And the biggest humiliation for Project Blue Book.
Right. But the kicker is Hynek was almost certainly right. That's the kicker. And that's been one of the big surprises of working on this book, is that I went into it knowing only the conventional wisdom, which was that Hynek was lying. He was covering up for the Air Force. He knew that these were real spaceships, but he wasn't going to admit it, so he called them swamp gas. That's all I knew. Well, I started doing research in the Kufos files and at the Northwestern archives, because he was teaching at Northwestern at the time. And I uncovered a completely different story than what I had always assumed to be the true story. So that's been the real rewarding part of working on this book, is going into these situations, these UFO cases that I've heard so much about, I've read so much about, and I have made certain assumptions about what really happened, to go back through historical documents and look at what really happened and how things were really investigated and how things were really, publicized in the press. Very often I come away with a completely different picture of the UFO sighting than what I thought was true. And that's just been incredibly fun and exciting. And it's really made the story of Hynek that much more interesting, because there's a lot more nuance and subtlety to these things than you ever would expect. And Hynek is a very, very interesting guy. He was not a sap. He was not a stoolie for the Air Force. He was a very complicated guy. And I just want to throw this out there too as another tease. It's not just that he was fighting for scientific accuracy. He was, but there was also a part of Hynek that was very enamored with mysticism. And that is a big part of the story as well. And we'll talk about that next time.
That sounds great. And so where can people follow you as you're writing the book, as you're doing your UFO investigations and the things that you're talking about? I mean, I'm looking over our list of things to talk about, and some of the questions I've taken from the posts I've read on your blog. And so there's a ton of interesting stuff. If you're into UFOs, and especially a blog with a personality, where can people find you, Mark?
HighStrangenessUFO.com.
And we're going to put a link to that in the show notes.
Oh, great.
Thanks very much for hanging out with us today, Mark. We really appreciate it.
It's been fun. Thanks for the time.
We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
The song this week is a love song, and that's not something we do too much of, but when we can bring aliens into it, well, we'll love just about anything. This song is called Reverse Engineering.
For every little sorrow and every little sigh, for every time I scream, every time you cry, for all the moments wasted on some tiny crime, we'll never be new again. will never be new again. When you came into my life, I was wasted and afraid. Everything you did was my favorite, every moment a holiday. My jokes are still hilarious, your mood is still gregarious. We'll never be new again, we'll never be new again. It's not rocket science, reverse engineering love. It's not rocket science, reverse engineering love. Take the moments you remember and the places that you treasure, and cross the rivers under all the bridges that we burned. There's no drug to recreate things past their expiration date, and I hope there's more to life than just waiting for our turn. It's not rocket science, reverse engineering love. It's not rocket science, reverse engineering love. Just like the German scientists after the war, rebuild all the spaceships that came crashing through our door. All these chemical machines and their adolescent dreams are much more than slaves to our biologic needs. It's not rocket science, reverse engineering love. It's not rocket science, reverse engineering love. All the singers that will say that love just fades away, they don't have to live inside our lives every day. No, we'll never be new again. No, we'll never be new again. But that don't mean we quit, that's no reason it should end. No, we'll never be new again. No, we'll never be new again. But that don't mean we quit, that's no reason it should end. It's not rocket science, reverse engineering love. It's not rocket science, reverse engineering love.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at OthersidePodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.